Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration, and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome back, friends, to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. It's a science-focused podcast where we explore, where we learn, and where we also improve our lives together. Does DNA affect who we become? If you have siblings or if you have children, then you can probably tell that, well, we as humans, we can be both very similar and also dissimilar. And in today's episode, Professor Robert Plomin, he tells us about how DNA affects who we become and the importance of both DNA and the environment. We will also discuss the importance of DNA for preventing health problems and for having better lives. Robert Plomin is a professor in Behavioural Genetics at the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's College London. He has published more than 800 papers and is the author of the best-selling textbook in the field, as well as a dozen other books. And his most recent book is Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. So, without further ado, please enjoy. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Very nice to have you here. It's a real pleasure. And today we're going to talk about some fascinating stuff. We're going to talk about DNA, and we're also going to talk about how that affects us. So I think it's very interesting to discuss this with you.
Well, thanks. It's my life's work, so I'm always happy to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. You've been working on this for quite a while, haven't you?
Yeah, I went to graduate school in the early 1970s, so it's getting on 50 years.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So about this, like how did you get interested in DNA and everything?
Well, there's a long version and a short version of this story, but the sort of short version is I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin in psychology. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how the environment works. And this is an example of the way the environment works, sort of like chance, with these tipping points and turning points in your life, I think, which most people see when they look back on their life and ask themselves, how did I get here? Why am I the way I am? And this is a great example of that. I went to graduate school at Texas because I had grown up in inner city Chicago, and we were a poor family, and no one went to university. But I got a scholarship to go to graduate school at the University of Texas. And so being a good inner city kid, I said, well, that sounds like a good deal because they were going to pay me to go.
Yeah.
But then I went to this place, and it's a good department of psychology. But what I didn't know is they had the only course in the world in psychology on behavioral genetics, that is, studying genetic influences in psychology. And that may not sound like much now, but back then it was dangerous, really, professionally and sometimes personally, to even talk about genetic influence. Psychology was so dominated by environmentalism, the view that you are what you learn. That is, who you are is a function of what happened to you environmentally. Genetics never got mentioned. So I took this course in my second year of graduate school, along with 40 other, graduate students. And what I can't understand is I was floored by that course. I just absolutely loved it. And I knew from early on in that class, I was going to do this the rest of my life. Yet the other 39 students, not one of them went on to become interested in it or to use it. And I really don't understand why it was. It it was really jaw-dropping for me. So from that moment on, in the early 70s, I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I started out studying mice, and then I studied, because I developed a severe allergy to the mice,
Yeah.
I went on to study human development.
What was the allergy, or what happened?
Yeah, well, I was interested in studying mice because they give you great power to look at genetics, because you can manipulate genetics in mice, and you can study the environment as well. And because in those days, in the early 70s, there was nothing like health and safety.
Right.
And because I was a meager graduate student, I was studying these mice in basically a closet, an unventilated closet.
Yeah.
And many people would develop an allergy in that situation. But I developed an allergy that was so severe that if someone gave me a piece of paper that had been in a mouse lab, I'd start an allergic reaction. So it was clear to me I had to finish my work in a suit, basically, with air being pumped in because I was so sensitive to it. So I decided I wanted to study human development then, and I did a twins study which compares identical and non-identical twins using parent reports of young children's personality or temperament. And from there, I just went on, to adoption studies and other studies. And so that's definitely how I got into it. But I can't really answer your question, why.
Right. Okay.
I know how I got into it, but I don't quite know why I did. In part, I wonder sometimes if it's it appealed to me because I had studied psychology as an undergraduate, and I had never heard about genetics. If you look at the textbooks of the time, there's nothing said about genetics. And here was this early work in the 60s and 70s suggesting that genetics was very important, inherited DNA differences. So somehow the power and novelty of that really appealed to me. And I think the other side of it is sort of personality. I think appetites, what interests you, it's hard to kind of explain when you look back on your career, like why you, Andre, are doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
But in this case, one thing is you had to be pretty tough because in those days, it was really, some people said professional suicide to get into genetics. Right. Because psychology was so opposed to the notion of genetics. They really wanted to believe everything was caused by environment, and especially the early environment of how your parents treated you. So I think it was also, it kind of fit with my personality in a way. And also I knew I didn't want to just turn the crank in research. I didn't just want to do little incremental studies, which a lot of people do. And it's probably a good professional strategy, to take a systematic, slow, progressive approach to one very small area. But I always liked the idea, I'd like big ideas, and things that could really make a difference. And as I did these early studies, I became convinced that genetics was very powerful. Yeah. It wasn't just like little effects. And then you start thinking about, what does this mean for everything we've talked about in psychology? Yeah. It really turns everything upside down.
Right, and I think that perhaps we could get into to the basic concepts also for the listener who's not that familiar with this kind of stuff. So I think if we could start talking about DNA, about genes, and about environment, just to define the concepts in a pedagogical way. So if you would start off by explaining just what DNA is, what do you say to that?
Yes, well, the title of my book is Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. And I'm talking about inherited DNA differences. So DNA involves these 3 billion base pairs, like steps in a spiral staircase, the double helix of DNA.
Exactly, yeah.
So we have 3 billion of those steps in the spiral staircase. And for 99% of them, we're all the same. You and I would have exactly the same base, we call it. And but for that's what makes us human. But the 1% of those steps that differ is what makes us different. It makes us individuals. That's what that's the genetic contribution to personality and mental health and illness and cognitive abilities and disabilities. So the title of the book is Blueprint: How DNA Makes Us Who We Are, and it should say as individuals. We're talking about that 1% of DNA that differs between us, and we're asking the extent to which that makes us different in our behavior.
Right. Okay. So it's a lot about like how DNA impacts who we become.
Exactly right. Yes.
Right.
And what's interesting about that, in a way, is that you start life as a single cell. The combination of egg and sperm from your mother. That one cell has a set of DNA in the inside of the cell called the nucleus. That DNA is the same DNA in all the trillions of cells in your body. So that's why we can extract DNA from any cell. We can get it from hair or saliva or urine or blood or skin. Every cell in your body has that same DNA, which I think is so remarkable, really. So what that means, though, is if you have a DNA difference, you and I have a DNA difference, we're asking, does that difference make a difference in a behavior that interests us, like personality or schizophrenia?
Right. Exactly. So if one gene is different, that is different in all of the genes.
In all the cells in your body,
yeah. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. I was also talking about then, or thinking about. So why do you think that DNA is important for us as human beings?
Well, DNA is our blueprint. The 99% of the DNA base pairs that are the same for all of us is what makes us human, and it's remarkable in a way that when you're copying, every cell in your body has to duplicate that DNA from the original cell. And the chances that there's a mistake is remarkably small, but these mistakes happen, called mutations.
Yeah.
And a lot of these mutations, if they're devastating, and many are, then they won't persist in the population, because if they kill you when you're young before you have babies, that's the end of that mutation. So some of them, though, don't make it, aren't lethal, and some of them don't make much of a difference. But some of them make a little bit of difference positively, maybe some make a difference negatively. And I think what happens is a lot of the DNA differences affect many different traits. We tend to think of one gene, one trait, but it's not like that at all. All the traits that interest us in psychology, as well as in medicine, complex traits like heart disease or diabetes, these are all influenced by many, many genes of small effect. And so I think it's the almost chance effect of these many genes. Now, some of them were selected for. The mutations are positive. They help you rather than hurt you. Classic example is like sickle cell anemia, which was a mutation that happened long ago, tens of thousands of years ago, that made some people with one copy of that gene. You get each of your genes come in two sets, one from your mother, one from your father. And most of the problematic genes, the deleterious mutations like sickle cell anemia, they're very bad when they're inherited. We get two copies, one from each parent. But if you have one copy, you're called a carrier. And sometimes carriers are at an advantage. And in sickle cell anemia, if you're living in a malarial area, like Southern Europe or some bits of Africa, it protects you from malaria, right, having one copy. Having two copies is bad, because what it does is it modifies your blood cells, and it's called sickle cell anemia, because instead of nice fat concave blood cells, red blood cells, they're sickled. They're like someone poked them and made them convex instead of concave.
Yeah.
So that's an example of how mutation can promote some of these mutations. But the point we've learned in the last few years is, although there are thousands of single gene disorders like sickle cell anemia or but there's really about 7,000 people talk about. Most of them are very rare because mutation selection tries to keep them down. But many persist as carriers in the carrier state because it's either positive, like sickle cell anemia, or it's okay. It doesn't make much of a difference. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why the reason most of the single gene disorders are recessive is that if it weren't recessive and all you needed was one copy and it was bad for you, it would be knocked out right away, unless because you wouldn't reproduce. So if you take the one of the first ones that was discovered relevant to psychology is called Phenylketonuria, PKU. And that was discovered in the 40s, and it was like a recessive. They knew it was a recessive disorder because you can look in families, and you can. I won't explain that now, but you can really say yes, that's a single gene recessive disorder. That is, if you have the disorder, you have two copies of the gene, then both parents must be carriers for it. That's the only way the kid could have two copies of it.
Right.
So that's called PKU. Now, if that were a dominant trait, well, the thing about phenylketonuria is it leads to it's very bad for the developing brain, and it led to severe mental retardation, and people had to be institutionalized. So it was a very bad sort of disorder. And if it had been dominant, though, it would be wiped out right away because those people who had the disorder wouldn't reproduce. But because, although it's very rare, 1 in 10,000, say, Europeans have two copies of it. They actually have the disease called phenylketonuria. 1 in 50 of us are carriers. And the carriers slip through evolution because we can't detect any real difference for carriers. It's only when you get it in the double dose that's important, that creates the disease. And that's an interesting trait too, because it was the first time that understanding the genetic mechanism led to a treatment. So I don't know if you or your listeners know that in almost all countries, they screen for phenylketonuria at birth or in the first few days of life. Have you seen that in England, we call it the Guthrie test, where you prick the heel of a newborn and you get just a drop or two of blood. And what they're doing is testing for this phenylketonuria, PKU. And the reason they're doing that is because you can prevent this devastating disorder from taking place if you control the diet. So the problem with phenylketonuria is you have a mutation in this gene that produces an enzyme that breaks down an amino acid called phenylalanine. So, that sounds complicated, but if you can't break that phenylalanine down, which you get from the diet, red meat and dairy products, and especially from mother's breast milk, if you can't break down phenylalanine, it builds up in the baby's brain. And when that happens, it's for reasons we still don't understand, 80 years later, it causes the brain to develop very badly. And so by, what would you do if you knew that? What people said is, well, then if we just take phenylalanine out of the diet, we'll bypass that. And that's what's happened. So that's a good example, though, of where this is all going. It's cost benefit. Almost every country in the world screens for this because the cost of screening is negligible compared to the huge costs of not screening.
I was interested also if you perhaps could focus on a question that I find pretty interesting, which is like, how can the science of DNA help us to have better lives?
Well, now we're jumping ahead in my career, but
yeah.
I'm glad to do that.
Yeah.
I spent the first 30 years just trying to understand the extent to which genetics influences behavior.
Yeah.
So back then, we couldn't study DNA. It's really only in the last 15 years or so we were able to study DNA itself. Instead, what we did was to use methods like the twin method that compares identical twins and non-identical twins. Identical twins are clones of one another. They have the same DNA. They come from a fertilized egg that splits in the first few days of life. So they have the same DNA. The other type of twin, which is about 2/3 of all twins, is called non-identical or fraternal twins. And they're like any brother and sister. So they're separately fertilized eggs. They have a different egg and a different sperm. So they're 50% similar genetically, not 100%.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what I did my dissertation on, twin method. There's been thousands of twin studies throughout the life sciences. So for 30 years, I did that, and I did twin studies and adoption studies. Adoption studies separate genetic and environmental influence by studying, say, parents and offspring who are not genetically related, like when parents adopt children. And then they compare it to adoptive parents who are not genetically related to the kids, but they provide the kids family environment. So all of those studies led to the findings that genetics is important across the board in psychology. And it also told us a lot about the environment, which I hope to come on to. So that was the first 30 years of my career. And I would have been very happy if my career had ended there. But then along came the DNA revolution, which really changed everything. Because with the sequencing of the human genome and other technical advances, we're now able to study DNA itself, which is a huge step forward in science and also in society. So you think about that PKU example I just gave you. In the past, people only found out that they're carriers for PKU or any of the other thousands of disorders if they've had a kid who's affected. So if you and your spouse are carriers, you have a 25% chance that an offspring will get a double dose of this. It's kind of simple probability. If you're a carrier, your kid could get one. Everyone has two copies, two chromosomes, it's called, of where we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and each chromosome comes in a pair, one from the mother, one from the father. So what I'm saying is the 3 billion base pairs of DNA are chopped up into 23 segments called chromosomes. So if you were a carrier, it means on one chromosome, maybe from your mother, maybe from your father, you have this mutation for PKU. Because your partner is also a carrier, he or she would also have one copy. So it's like flipping coins here. Your kid could get no copies of the mutation, 25% chance of that. They could get one copy. There's a 50% chance of that.
Yeah.
Or they could get two copies. And that's the 25%. So in the past, you'd only know you're a carrier if you actually have a child who has one of these single gene disorders. But now, because DNA testing is so cheap, many people are getting their, we call it genotypes, that is all the DNA tested. I can go into the techniques by which that's done. But the point is, over 25 million people have paid to do this, to find out about their genes, really to predict, say, psychological traits. But what I'm focusing on here is what I think might be the most important advance that's come from the DNA revolution. And that is that if you do your DNA testing and your prospective partner does DNA testing, one of the things it'll tell you is if you are a carrier for any of these mutations. You're not likely to be to have the disorder because you would know about that. Yeah. These are pretty serious disorders. But you wouldn't know if you're a carrier. So even though, like in the case of phenylketonuria, PKU, it's only 1 in 10,000 people have the disorder, but 1 in 50 people are carriers. So that means if you're a carrier, the chances that this person you're thinking of, say, marrying or whatever people do these days, you'd have a 2% chance that that person would also be a carrier. And you can find that out before. you don't have to wait until you have a child who's affected. So this is why George Church, who's one of the most well-known geneticists in America at Harvard and MIT, he's just started in the last few months a company called Digi, D-I-G-I, D8, which, as your listeners will know, is internet slang for date.
Yeah, right.
Digi-date, and he's been pilloried for that. Like talking about genetic matchmaking. But really, what he wants to do is to offer a service that would allow prospective couples to find out if they have not just the 40 or 100 mutations, if they're carriers for these, that most of these DNA companies will provide, but to sequence all 3 billion base pairs of DNA for each partner to see if they have any matches for any of these mutations. And, if you're in love with someone and they have one of these mutations, if you're matched for it, doesn't mean you can't get married, but you would know ahead of time what you're up against. You have to decide, maybe you won't have children. Maybe you'll adopt a child. There are other things you can do, though. I'm sure your listeners will know about in vitro fertilization. That's what a lot of people who are carriers do, is they then exclude. Should I explain in vitro fertilization, do you think? Or
yeah, you can just do it like a short summary of the...
Yeah. But it basically involves extracting eggs from a woman and fertilizing them with the partner's sperm or someone else's sperm, and then you create embryos. And you let the embryos grow up until 5 days or so when they're 250 cells. And you take some of those cells, you extract DNA, and you can do DNA testing on those embryos to find out if they have the carrier. And you usually do about a dozen eggs, and a quarter of them would be expected to have a double dose of the mutation. And you would exclude them and not transplant them into the woman.
Right.
So that's how it's used these days. But it might well be that, for example, that it might be more widely useful, this technique of carrier detection, it's called. In New York, there's an Orthodox Jewish community who screen all of their teenagers for one particular mutation. And that is in Ashkenazi Jews, they have a mutation called Tay-Sachs that leads to Tay-Sachs disease, which is a horrible sort of disease, that starts to occur early in life. And it's in high frequency in that particular population. Not so much in other populations. But by screening their teenagers, because it's an Orthodox Jewish community, they do matchmaking anyway. And they thought, why would we not want to know whether this particular match is matched for the mutation for Tay-Sachs? And so by doing this, they've actually cut down on the rate of Tay-Sachs. And I want to emphasize, it doesn't mean, it's not like a totalitarian government saying you cannot marry someone who has a matched mutation with you. But it's just an example of how useful this information can be, which was your question. How will this be useful for us? And it'll be useful in so many ways. I'm excited about this because I'm writing my next book on this issue. I think the working title is Parenting After the DNA Revolution. So I want to focus on issues related to parents. And what I just described is related to parents. It's before they become parents, for example. But this is really going to revolutionize medicine. Do you know, in England, the government has just decided they're going to offer DNA testing for adults and for all newborns.
Right.
Not make people do it, but to offer this. And I think that's great because it's like a wild west out there with these, we call them direct-to-consumer DNA companies. There are now 250 of these companies that do DNA testing for people. On the internet. It's called direct-to-consumer. And some of them are very well known, 23andMe. A lot of people do it for ancestry, to find out like I found out, for example, I'm 2/3 from Eastern Asia and Eastern Europe, and you can get down to particular communities. So it's kind of interesting, but it also gives you information about health. And one of the things it provides is information about these carrier tests. But the reason the NHS, National Health Service here, is doing it is because DNA is the most powerful predictor of problems. And the thought is, if you can prevent problems from occurring, like heart attacks or diabetes or obesity or alcoholism, it's got to be so much better than waiting until the disorder occurs and then try to fix it, because we're not very good at that.
Exactly. And that is, like, I find one of the probably most interesting things about this, that if you could know that you have a higher tendency or you have a higher risk of, for example, having heart problems,
Exactly.
then that person would probably, if you would know that you will have a higher risk, then you would want to do the things that will decrease the risk, probably.
The things that we're all supposed to do, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Eat well and exercise and that sort of thing. But right now in the UK, there was a recent study that showed that with DNA alone, you can predict that 8% of the UK population is walking around with a clinically significant risk of heart attack.
Yeah.
And people say, well, but you could detect it through scans or whatever. But the amazing thing about DNA is you could predict it from early in life. You don't have to wait until you start getting fuzzy arteries, and start having symptoms. You could do stuff about it early. And as you say, a lot of it could start with low-tech solutions. Like if the NHS told you you're at a 10-fold greater risk of having a heart attack, you might pay attention to the message that everybody gets about eating well and exercising. But if those low-level interventions and low-cost interventions don't work, there are other things that you can do. Like there are ways you can do whole body scans, and you can detect hardening of the arteries long before it can show up physiologically. And you can do blood tests, and so there's an awful lot you can do in terms of prevention. But all of medicine is moving away from this model of curing diseases once they occur, to preventing them. And DNA is the best way of predicting problems, because it doesn't change. So you could predict early in life. And what we know about interventions is the earlier they start, the better they are. And so with DNA, you can start long before someone starts showing physiological symptoms. And one more thing about that is that in the UK, it's said that a severe heart attack causes, they say 700,000 euros.
Yeah.
Now, it's hard to estimate these things, but it costs a whole lot of money. And that's not to mention the suffering and the loss of quality of life and all of that. So really, if you could prevent a few heart attacks, you can go a long way towards paying for these programs, plus just making a better society, by promoting health rather than curing illness. And what really excites me about it is, I don't know to what extent in Sweden you have private insurance versus a national health service.
We have a national health system, and you can go private as well.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of what we have here, although I think maybe 95% of the people are rely on the National Health Service. And what I think is important about this is, I think the DNA revolution is going to be the death toll for for insurance-based health systems. I don't know how they can survive it, because if you knew you had this severe risk for heart attacks, you would want to insure yourself. And the companies won't put up with that. They'll say it's pre-existing condition. But if they found out that you have this risk, because it's a financial exchange, they're going to say, well, we can't insure you. Or if we insure you, it's going to cost you a huge amount of money to be insured. Whereas in a national health service, you distribute the risk across the population, and you also can make decisions about across the board. You can say, we can't really afford to do this. We can't use this drug. We can't do that surgery. It's not cost effective. So I think it really there's some feeling in England that, the NHS is kind of a throwback to socialist 1940s, after the war or whatever. But I think it's the way of the future. It's the only way to rationally deal with the DNA revolution and health. Because insurance-based systems, they really get paid, hospitals get paid when they cure your heart attack. There's nothing in it financially for them to have you prevent a heart attack. It's kind of a scary thought, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But
Yeah.
I was thinking about this. So how much of, like, let's say heart attacks or heart problems or other like big health problems, how much can we tell by our, like,
Yeah.
you understand the question, like how
I
much
do
do we
understand,
understand? Yeah.
Well, the first question is, to what extent is it heritable?
Right.
Is it None of these complex traits are 100% heritable. The thing about the single gene mutations like phenylketonuria is we call them necessary. They're necessary and sufficient in that you only have the disorder if you have the mutation. So they kind of explain 100% of the disorder. Like with
Exactly.
phenylketonuria.
And
right.
then it's not as common, right? It's
They're
those
very
ones,
rare.
Yeah, exactly.
They're very rare. Like PKU is one of the more common ones, at 1 in 10,000
Yeah,
people.
yeah.
Many of them are 1 in 100,000, 1 in 500,000. So they're very rare. And they're important. They say they account for maybe 5%. Some people say 10% of the medical burden in society. Because although they're rare, they're devastating.
Yeah.
In fact, the ones we see, believe it or not, are the least devastating. The vast majority of these mutations are responsible for the maybe 50% spontaneous abortion rate. That is, many people are pregnant women and don't know about it because it's such a bad mutation that the embryo fetus doesn't really develop, and you actually abort even before you know you're pregnant. So that's the single gene story. So it's important, and if you have one of those, like the scary one now is Huntington's disease or Alzheimer's, and if you do one of these testing companies, you could find out instead of that you're at a 60% risk of having Alzheimer's when you get old.
Right.
So those single gene sorts of effects are very devastating for the people who have them. But the vast majority of our medical problems in society are what we call common disorders, like heart disease, obesity, diabetes. There's dozens of these. And they're not caused by single genes. They're caused by many genes, a small effect. And for none of them is genetics the whole story. So we talk about, the word you hear a lot is heritability. Heritability is a 6-syllable word that's often misunderstood, but what we're talking about is the extent to which inherited DNA differences account for differences between people in traits. Like height is about 90% heritable, but most complex traits, including medical disorders like cardiovascular disease or diabetes, are about 50% heritable. That means that 50% of the differences between people in their risk for, say, having heart attacks is due to inherited DNA differences. It's not 100%. And that the other 50% that's not due to inherited DNA differences is what we loosely call the environment.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it's the environment that everyone thought was important. So, like in the case of, say, obesity or body weight, that's about 60% heritable, which surprises people. No one's surprised about height being heritable. But I think people are surprised that most of the differences between people in weight are due to inherited DNA differences.
Yeah, yeah.
But what's even more interesting in some ways is that the environmental part of that isn't the environment we thought was important. That is, all of our theories have to do with how parents feed their kids, the lifestyles they model for the kids, how active you are and that sort of thing. But we know that's not true because, all the behavioral genetic data converge on that. But one simple piece of data tells the story. Parents and offspring, and siblings who grow up in the same family are similar in weight. Well, back in the days of environmentalism, people said, "Oh, no problem. That's because they share the same family environment. Parents are responsible for making their kids heavy or not." But what's fascinating is that kids adopted away at birth from their biological parents through adoption are just as similar to their birth parents as children are who grow up with their own genetic parents. And the converse of that is just as interesting. Adopted children are not at all similar to their adoptive parents in weight. And furthermore, adoptive siblings, that is, two children adopted into the same family who are not genetically related, they correlate zero. That is, they're not at all similar in body weight.
Right. Let's just see so I understand it. So if you're adopted by another family, then it's more about the genes from your actual biological parents than the environment you live in. And if you are two people who got adopted to the same family, then that the environment doesn't really affect their weight. So one can be weigh more and one can weigh less then.
Yeah, exactly right. It is the environment, but it's not the environment we thought was important. It's not what we call it shared family environment, which is what Freud and most of the other environmentalists thought was important. That's why they even thought schizophrenia they knew ran in families. They always assumed that was because parents drive their kids nuts.
Right, yeah.
But we now know that there's nature and nurture. Nature is, what we talk about as genetics. That also runs in families. So you can't say family resemblance for weight or for schizophrenia or anything else. You can't assume it's environmental. In fact, we now know it's not due to the shared family environment. Most family resemblance is due to genetics, but the environment's important. However, it's a totally different sort of environment than anyone thought about before. And that's why I always say that I think genetics contribution to psychology has been as much in understanding the environment as it is in understanding genetics. And the reason for that is psychology ignored genetics for so long that everything they studied was confounded. Parents do things to their kids and their kids have a certain outcome. You assume that's due to environment. But say parents who read a lot to their kids have kids who read better when they go to school. Why is that? Well, you could assume, it's not crazy to think it, that the parents reading to the kids made the kids better when they got to school in reading.
Yeah.
But once you start thinking about genetics, you say, well, wait a minute now. Those parents and kids are 50% related genetically. That means parents who like to read and good at reading are likely to have kids, even if they were adopted away at birth, who like to read and read well when they get to school. But even more important, and this is called the nature of nurture, I think that correlation between parents reading to kids and how well kids read at school, it goes in the other direction. It's not the parents causing the kids reading, it's the kids causing the parents reading.
Right.
And now that I have grandchildren, I really see that. I think we respond to genetic differences in our kids more than we create the differences. So I have one grandchild who would let me read all day long to her. That's what I thought grandchildren were for. You say, come and I'll read a story to you.
Yeah,
then I have another grandchild who it would almost be abusive if I made him sit there and listen to me read to him. He wants to go out and kick a ball around. He wants to rough and tumble, that sort of thing. So I think to a much greater extent than parents realize, we're responding to genetic differences in ourselves, but also in our children, rather than creating them. So that's why I'm excited about writing this book about parenting, because there are literally thousands of books written on parenting, and yet not one talks about genetics. How can you, after these 50 years of research, how can you talk about parents and children without mentioning genetics? It just boggles my mind. But it makes it, kind of fun to be writing this book.
Right. So what you're saying basically then, so what you're saying is that different children are have different genetics. We have different personalities, and then we adopt to each individual.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. And very often novelists write about these sorts of things in a way that appeals to people more. And I'm sure people in Sweden know Karl Ove Knausgård. And do you know who I mean? Who's written?
I actually don't, but I'm not a big reader of
Oh,
those
really?
kind of books,
Okay.
so sorry.
Well, I think 1/4 of the Norwegian population have read his books, and I understand that they're also very popular in Sweden.
Yeah,
But
probably.
I
Yeah.
mean, basically, I mean, he writes about Proust, Marcel Proust. He writes about life in great detail. So this 7,500 pages of autobiography, and he describes his 3 children growing up in great detail. And he says he assumed, like most parents, that kids are blank slates and parents just mold them to be what they want them to be. But then, as his kids started, even from very early in life, he saw such differences in temperament between them. And he says, "There's no way I did that." And that's I think a lot of that reflects a lot of parents' experience with their kids, and leads to the saying that parents are environmentalists until they have more than one child. So with your first child, you can say, "Oh yeah, well, she's shy because I didn't take her out very much when she was young." Or I find the other explanation is I took her out too much when she was young. It's part of the problem with environmental explanations. You can explain anything after the fact. But then when you have a second child, because these things are heritable, you'd expect them to be different. If one's very shy, chances are the other one won't be so shy. And then you start saying, I didn't do that. I mean, if you took kids out a lot, you still do that. So parents begin to realize that those differences in their children must be for some other reason than the way they treated them. And that's where genetics comes in. And in fact, this is really the nail in the coffin for assuming that parents have a huge impact on children, because the environmental theories are based on what the shared environment, that is, the environment, family environment that parents provide to their children. But how can you explain differences then? Why are children in the same family so different? Whereas genetics predicts it, because the first law of genetics is like begets like. You and your kids, siblings, are 50% similar genetically, but that means they're 50% different genetically. So for a heritable trait like height or personality or mental illness, genetics predicts that kids growing up in the same family will be different, not just similar. So yeah, so that's why I do think it's an important point that as people come to accept genetics, which I find they really do. Over the last year, I've probably given 30 talks, and I'm going to be talking in Sweden, I think, in uh, April or something like that. And I find that people are much more accepting of genetics than they used to be. In fact, um, I I think they're very. I don't get people coming up upset about talking about genetics, even in terms of parents. Andre, can you still hear me? Okay, I got a call in, and it kind of ran my Skype.
Yeah, no
Okay,
worries.
sorry.
No worries.
So
Yeah.
so I was just saying, I find that people are much more accepting now of genetic influence. But what they haven't come to appreciate, and which I think is very important for parents, is that genetics has told us that the environment works very differently from the way we thought it worked. It's not making kids growing up in the same family similar. Whatever it is, it's making kids in the same family different. So I think that is such an important finding, and it's one I highlight in Blueprint, and I'm going to talk about it even to a greater extent in this new book I'm writing on parenting.
Right. And I mean, a big part then uh, is genetic, but then environment and like, how our lives are is also a big part. So how does the environmental part of everything affect who we become and our personality, for example?
Yes, well, that's a great question, and I think things have changed so much. We know much more about genetics than we do about the environment now, and in part that's because we always thought we knew how the environment worked, but we didn't take genetics into account. So all that earlier work is confounded in the sense that, schizophrenic parents have schizophrenic children. That doesn't mean it was caused environmentally. In fact, we now know it wasn't. It's caused genetically. The environment's important, but it makes children in the same family different from one another. So, um, that's called non-shared environment. And that's one of the big findings about the environment from genetic research. But the other big one, which we haven't touched on much yet, is the nature of nurture. That is, genes don't do anything by themselves. If you put DNA on the table in front of you, it won't do anything. It has to be in a cell, and that cell has to be in a body, and it grows up in this environment that it expects to find evolutionarily. Those genes were selected to be in certain environments within our bodies, but also outside our bodies. And the way genes work is to use the environment to foster the tendencies that you have genetically. So to make that concrete, I study cognitive development a lot, mental abilities like vocabulary and spatial ability and memory. And so I've done twin studies and adoption studies on those. People are surprised to find that one of the most heritable, most genetically influenced mental abilities is vocabulary. And people say, well, how can that be inherited? Because you can't inherit a word, and you can have a different language. You can grow up in a different country and have a different language. Well, the point is, it's not inherited; it's heritable. Mm. That is, DNA differences between people are responsible for, to a large extent, for differences in their vocabulary. It may be 70% heritable. That is, most of the differences between children in how easily they learn words and their verbal fluency and their scores on vocabulary tests is due to inherited DNA differences. And I really see that, like, again, with my grandchildren. I mean, one of them, the one who likes to read, is so into the verbal channel. I mean, she'll always ask, well, what's that word mean? She wants to know about nuances of words. The other kid who doesn't like to have me read,
want to play instead.
What he says is, whatever, you know what I mean.
Yeah, right.
And that's exactly the point. So who's going to develop a better vocabulary? But the point is, the DNA doesn't give you good scores on a vocabulary test. It just tunes you into a verbal channel so that you use your environment, that is me, when I talk to her or other people, to foster the development of those traits. It's called gene-environment correlation.
Right. So it's kind of
the way genes work.
So it's kind of you having your genes makes you kind of interested in words, and because you're interested in words, you explore words more. So perhaps if you're somebody else, so then it's maybe you have genes of being, I don't know, physically active, I don't know, like doing a lot of physical stuff, and then because you're interested in it, you also do it more, and then you develop that kind of.
Exactly right.
Okay.
No, exactly right. And so the 3 points I've made so far are that genetics is important. Very few people seem to question that anymore. We got to emphasize it's not all genetic. About 50% of what makes you who you are is environmental. But the second point is, it's not the environment we thought was important. Whatever it is, it's making two kids growing up in the same family different from one another. But the third point is the nature of nurture, which is the way genetics works is to, not to hardwire in vocabulary, but rather to have you use your environment to foster your genetic tendencies. And that's how you get to the title of my book, How DNA Makes Us Who We Are. It's saying that DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals. The environment's important, but it doesn't work in the systematic, shared family environment way that we had always assumed was important. And I don't know if in Sweden you've got this documentary film that's won several awards that came out last year called Three Identical Strangers.
Yeah, I think I have seen it, but I'm not sure if it's like a mainstream thing. But anyways, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it's streamed on Amazon and other streaming services. I'm not trying to sell the movie, yeah. But on the other hand, it's an amazing dramatization. I mean, a documentary, but it's an amazing illustration of the 3 points I just made. So the story is that this kid grew up in New York, and at the age of 19, he goes to a university in upstate, North New York State. And On the first day of class, his name's Bobby. And on the first day of class, everyone's calling him Eddie.
Right.
And he thought this was some sort of psychology experiment or something. But then he met Eddie, and it was like looking in a mirror. I mean, this other boy was just the same as him, even in not just in physical, indistinguishable physically, as identical twins mostly are, but more than that. I mean, even in their mannerisms and the clothes they wore, which fits with what you were saying, that it's not just the hard wiring, it's things like appetites and interests and attitudes. Well, the publicity that came from that, they quickly worked out they had the same birth date and that they were both adopted from the same adoption agency in New York City. But then the publicity that came from that led to the very unusual circumstance of a third identical twin. So I did say earlier, identical twins are caused when a single zygote, that is a fertilized egg, splits into two individuals in the first few days or weeks of life. Sometimes one of them splits again. So you've got three embryos who are genetically identical. They are clones of one another. And that's what happened in this case. And sure enough, the third one had also been adopted by the same adoption agency in New York City. So there's a bad part of the story. Why were they separated and nobody knew about it?
Yeah.
But the part I'm emphasizing here is that it's worth watching the film because it just shows the power of nature over nurture in the sense of shared family environment. The families were as different as you could get. One was an authoritarian parent, one was a kind of a lower class, poorer family, and the other was a middle class family with a school teacher. So, and they all differed in their parenting styles and all of that, which it turns out wasn't coincidental either. That's the bad part of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
But for now, nurture differed as much as they could have it differ. And yet these three boys were just so similar. They all were into wrestling. Now, this is in high school before they even knew about the other triplets. Well, it's not, in the United States, wrestling is something that's available in most high schools. And they just had the build for it. They're stocky and big hands and kind of competitive. And so I think it's an example of how genetics works, that why wrestling? It just kind of suited them. Another famous author, you probably won't know about, but he's famous for his wrestling. And he says that you just kind of do what you're good at, which is what you said earlier. You like to do something, you don't quite know why. Like I like behavioral genetics, I don't quite know why. But then if you like something, you do it more and you get better at it. Now, if you weren't any good at it, like I would never be a sprinter. I don't have the body for that.
All right.
And I could want to do it and try to do it, but I pretty quickly realized that that's not for me. But you find something you like to do, you're good at it, you do it more, and you get better and better at it.
Yeah.
So I think that this film is a great example of that, including the fact that it wasn't just personality, it also involved academic achievement. They were all well-read, obviously bright and verbally fluent, but they were all of that type. There's a type of kid who certainly is bright enough to do very well at school, but they just don't like it for whatever reason again. Maybe it's attitudes or whatever. When they got together then, they all decided to drop out of that university, and they started a nightclub restaurant in New York City called Triplets that made $1 million in the first year. They just kind of found their niche, and I think that's really what we need to do in life. But anyway, the other thing, it's not just personality, it's not just school achievement, but it's also psychopathology. It turned out all three of these identical twins are depressive, and they were actually treated for depression in adolescence, which is very unusual back in those days. So we're talking about the 50s. So I think the film is a very dramatic illustration of the 3 points I'm trying to make, that heredity is important, but the environment's important, but it's not the environment we thought was important. And also it has plenty of examples of the nature of nurture, where the triplets are selecting environments that are correlated with their genetic tendencies.
Yeah, I think that is very interesting, and also what we also talked about before. What I also find very interesting about, so let's say that you perhaps have some kind of heritability, like some kind of genetic disposition for having heart problems or whatever, and because if you have that, then by having that information, then you really know, or then you can prevent instead of have to deal with it, which is another, I think, is another good point.
Exactly right. I do think it's important to emphasize there that this is, it's probabilistic. Because these things aren't 100% heritable, we'll never be able to predict absolutely that you'll have a heart attack. But nothing in life is 100% certain, other than saying have a single gene disorder. But you get a lot of pushback on this, saying, "Oh, people are going to be fatalistic and think their life is over because they have this risk." Well, it's only if they don't understand how genetics works and the fact that it's probabilistic. But heart attacks is a great example. But another example is alcoholism. We don't yet have good DNA predictors of it. I mean, it predicts maybe 5% of the differences between people. But even so, that's a better prediction than you could make with anything else. It's as good a prediction as you can make by knowing a parent is alcoholic, for example. But if you knew your kid even had a high genetic risk of being alcoholic, you could say there's only a slight chance, but you have a risk of becoming alcoholic, drinking the same amount of alcohol as your friends. So why not play it safe? Why not just say, do what we're all supposed to do? Monitor your alcohol use, take a break from alcohol, see how addicted you are to it. And you cannot become alcoholic unless you drink an awful lot of alcohol. And we're better off medically anyway if we don't drink so much alcohol. So it's one of those things. It can't hurt, and people say, oh well, then they're going to be labeled and deterministic. I mean, I can't think there's any parent who's going to find out that their kid has a genetic risk for something and say, oh well, can't do anything about it. If you knew your kid was at high genetic risk for alcoholism, you say, oh well, can't do anything about it. No, obviously what you would do is you'd coach them and say, well, this is just something to pay attention to, and don't treat it as fatalistic. Don't say my life is ruined, I'm going to be alcoholic, because the point of it is you will not be alcoholic if you don't drink much alcohol.
Exactly. So it's a way of preventing, and also I think probably one important thing there is also, I mean, if you can do something about it or not, and also like if you have the resources,
yes,
to do it or not. So I mean, if let's say that you could be quite sure that you will get some kind of disease and there's nothing to do about it, then what do you think about that then?
That's a great point. And it's one of the reasons why I'm so thrilled about seeing this on the National Health Service. Because as I mentioned, if you go to any of these DNA testing companies like 23andMe, you could find out that you have a 60% risk of getting Alzheimer's, severe dementia, when you're older. And they're careful to say, are you sure you want to know this, etc. And many people don't want to know it. But when I ask a public audience, would you want to know? It's amazing. All different types of audience. 50% want it, 50% don't. Why don't you want it? Because there's nothing you can do about it, right? If you found out you're at that risk, there really is nothing. The only thing that's known is avoid head injuries. Don't become a boxer. Don't do a lot of heading with footballs, but mostly don't smack your head very often, as I do in this old 16th century house in England, where the doorways are about I don't know.
Yeah.
I know they're quite a few centimeters shorter than my head.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it is such a useful information, and what I like about it being on the NHS is I think they'll decide what kind of information to give people. And as you're suggesting, it should maybe be on the basis of what you can do about it. So with heart attacks, I think it's almost unethical, given what we know about the genetics, that we're not doing this for people. And you could say, I tell you, you're at this tenfold greater risk of having a heart attack, and you don't do anything about it. We could just say, well, you have the information, you're an adult. If you don't want to do anything about it, well, that's fine. But, you could go back and say, well, but here's a program that you might want to try, because we don't want you to have a heart attack.
Exactly. So you get the exactly. So you get the information, and also you get the what you need to be able to handle it in a better way.
Right. But I'm quite sure with Alzheimer's they wouldn't tell people.
Yeah.
Now I'm hoping, we're still trying to work this out in England, but I'm kind of hoping that they'll provide the information that these direct-to-consumer companies provide. They'll provide reports about diet and all of that sort of information. But the way it's done in Finland, there's been great uptake. They've started a pilot program of 1 million people or so doing this. And I understand that 85% of the people, when asked, do you want to be in this when you go to the hospital and they draw blood, 85% of the people say, sure. And in Estonia as well, the uptake's very high. Well, I think most people, they'll find out what they need to know. But I would like to circumvent these direct-to-consumer companies, which is like a wild west of quality and all of that, to say, well, if you want more information, you can have it. It's your DNA, but that's yet to be worked out.
Yeah, exactly. So people are doing it, so we have to help people to do it in the best way for them.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And some of these companies actually provide pretty crappy information to people, and that really pisses me off, because for the same amount of effort, they could do it right.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're going to give the rest of us a bad name by doing it so poorly. Yeah.
Exactly. And the important thing that you also alluded to earlier, I think, is how can we use this to be able to help people? So you get the information, and you also get the help you need to be able to handle the whatever turns up in your report. So I mean,
like dementia.
Exactly. I mean that for me also feels like the important thing. Like, how can we use this to be able to help people to have better lives, and how can we use this information to actually prevent and help people to not have diseases or not have other problems in their life. So yeah.
It's like the carrier test I mentioned. That scares a lot of people, but we could eliminate these thousands of single gene disorders by screening couples for being carriers. So anyway, I think it's important that we have some cheerleaders. And I think the important point to emphasize is that, this is not Big Brother trying to control people. And this is to try and help you and help people. And as I say, I think it's unethical that we don't do it, say for cardiovascular disease.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, as you said, trying to help people, and I mean, do it in a way that is good for. Do it in a way that is good for the people as well, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. Robert, it's been really, really nice talking to you, and I sure I learned a lot, and I think that everybody's listening has learned a lot too. So I would just like to say a big thank you for coming on.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's really great talking to you, and maybe we'll have a follow-up at some point, because there's so much happening in this area, of the DNA revolution.
For sure. And I also actually heard that your book actually is coming out has come out in Swedish.
Yes, it's by Nature and Culture. How do you pronounce that?
Natur och kultur.
Very good. Yeah, it came out in March.
Right.
So I hope people look at it, and I think I'm coming to talk in Stockholm at some point. I think in April or so. So I have a lot of colleagues, at the Karolinska Institute. They do some of the best work. The registers in Sweden, twin registers and family registers, are the best in the world. So some of the leading research is being done in Sweden on this, and some of my best friends work there. So in fact, 2 of my students are there right now as we're talking, attending a training workshop at the Karolinska.
Interesting.
So I do feel very attached to Sweden, and especially in this time of Brexit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you so much again.
Terrific. Great talking to you, Andrea.
Same. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
A rating and a review is a great thing, but if you will start to subscribe, you will make my heart sing. Have a great one, friends.